Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our online lecture today. At sa umaga pong ito, our discussion will be focusing on economic globalization. And here, we will be dividing this lesson into three. The first part will be a lesson on the economic systems during the pre-colonial era. The second part will be all about the economic systems during the colonial era and post-colonial era. And the third part will be about the age of the economic cooperation. And so we will now be starting with the economic system during the pre colonial era. Now, in the beginning, we know that there was a very simplistic economic system since people were nomadic and they were wanderers. So, hunting and gathering yung kanilang paraan ng pamumuhay. So isang kahig, isang tuka, meaning it's a hand-to-mouth subsistence to say the least. However, the agricultural revolution took place and it evolved into an agricultural economy where people were able to learn how to plant crops and domesticate animals. Of course, this was the moment of civilization when people started, instead of being nomadic and wandering around, they started to settle in areas where they feel like it's the best place kung saan sila pwedeng mag-settle at mabuhay. And so this is when wealth was measured by how much sheep or cattle one has. And because money was not yet invented, so this was the moment of the start of the civilization. So you talk about the Mesopotamian civilization, the Hindu civilization, and whatnot. And so before the invention of money, civilizations practiced barter trade. So this is a matter of trading goods for goods. Okay. And however, at this time, people, you have to understand that money was not created yet. So the economy in the city states and the ancient kingdoms, this was the moment when taxation was invented. However, the kind of taxation that they do have was not in cash. It was all in kind. And so uso na noong mga panahon noon, you talk about 10% of everybody's harvest goes to the king. Say, for example, if you harvest 100 sacks of potatoes, then 10 sacks of it will go to the king, and that 10 sacks is the tax that is given or paid to the city state and to the ancient kingdom. Aside from farming, some people became craftsmen and artisans during this time, and they were able to make clothes, shoes, baskets, tools, jewelry, and furniture. And they became the new players in the barter trade. And came the rise of the merchants or the traders. Some people became middlemen or what we call as merchants. And this is when trading expanded geographically because the merchants were traveling for barter with other communities. And then the merchants here on became a wealthy social class. And since wala pa naman na-invent na money at that time, gold became the trading currency. Now, during the age of the ancient empires, kingdoms invaded other kingdoms, as we know in history. Primarily, they do it for economic gains because the measure of wealth during that time was the amount of gold, the treasures, the agricultural produce, and the slaves that they do have. And it was only later on that money was invented. And so we will now proceed with the second part of our discussion, which is all about the economic systems during the age of colonialism. Now, again, when we speak of the age of colonialism, this was the moment, perhaps during the uh, 15th century, 16th century here in the Philippines, when Spain and Portugal became the two superpowers, dividing the world into two. Now, during the age of colonialism, let us now look at the economic systems of the world. And so during the age of the of mercantilism, as was a time when people operated only in small concentric circles of trade. They do not really have to travel that far or intercontinental just to trade their goods. Now, perhaps if you understand the age of discovery, this was the time when we talk about gold as the standard. So we talk about the quote unquote the golden rule. Now, he who has the gold at that time definitely is the one who rules. Since there is no money, gold has become the standard of the wealth of the kingdoms. And so European kingdoms tried to accumulate as much gold as possible. But with the age of discovery, nag-widen yung kanilang operation because the empires were now operating intercontinentally. And so this happened at a time when Europe became the center of the economy, which is now a global economy. So later on, this is what we now know as the Industrial Revolution, which all started in France. Now, the overseas colonies became the periphery of the center economy, which is Europe. The overseas colonies, meaning the colonized um, countries, the colonized lands at that time. Later on, the United States also became a center of economic power at that time. Now, when we talk about the center, this is where the factories are by virtue of the Industrial Revolution. And when we speak of the periphery, this refers to the farms, the sources of the raw materials. However, there came an imbalance of the world because the center became richer, wealthier, while the periphery or the farms, the sources of raw materials remained poor. Now, post-colonial era, after the Second World War, the centers released their respective peripheries. This was the time of the decolonization, as we know it. The Western powers gave independence to their colonies, and so we now have post-colonial era and what we call as the time of neo-colonialism. Now, this is when the first world continued to flourish economically, while the third world, which are the agriculture based economies, struggle to improve economically. Say, raw materials like sugar and copra are cheap, while finished products like, say, for example, Coca Cola and shampoo are expensive. Of course, who will get the higher income? Definitely those who have their finished products already. But the old economic order remained. The newly independent countries, which were the former colonies of the superpowers at that time, we also call them as the third world, still exports raw materials to their former colonizers. In return, these Western powers, the powerful countries during the colonization period, or what we call as the first world countries, export finished products to their former colonies. Say, for example, the Philippines, we export sugar to the US. In return, the US exports candies, chocolates, Coca Cola to our country, which are finished products already. Now, banks of the first world, like the IMF or the International Monetary Fund and the WB or World Bank, loaned money to the third world countries. In the process, the rich countries got more control over them because of the loans that give to these third world countries. Meanwhile, in the communist bloc, trade happens only among themselves. So this is what we call as the second world. Now, the big communist countries, say for example, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republic or the USSR and China, exports to the smaller communist states. These are what we called as the satellite states, what they need. Say, for example, military hardware like tanks, guns, bombs, and others. However, we also have the small communist countries like during that time where they became the centers of exports, okay, where these big communist countries are exporting like North Korea, North Vietnam, and Cuba. After the Second World War, it was only during that time that petroleum was discovered in the Middle East. And so the Middle Eastern countries rose to become economic powers by exporting oil, okay, and controlling the um, supply of oil to the rest of the world. Now, we have a new set of countries that are powerful economically, but they are not considered as first world, second world, neither are considered as third world countries. And so they organize their own bloc, and they call themselves as the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. In your screen, you will see here some of the members of the OPEC. We'll start from the top. We have Qatar, Iran, Ecuador, Venezuela, United Arab Emirates. You have Iraq. You have Libya, Kuwait, Algeria, Saudi Arabia, Nigeria, and Angola. So these are the countries members of the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. Now, these Arab states control the prices of petroleum products worldwide. If they drill oil quickly and in large quantities, there will be an oversupply. So the prices will go down. But if they slow down the drilling of oil, there will be a shortage of supply. So they will be controlling the prices of the oil. And so definitely the prices will grow up. And so in the New World Order, so you will see that countries are grouped by the United Nations. With the collapse of communism in the 1990s, the first, second, and third worlds labeling of the countries of the world became outdated. Although right now, we still know these types of division by the according to economic industries worldwide. Now, the labeling system we have now is developed countries and developing countries. Now, they're used the term developed is at least in reference to the former territories which they call before, or nation states which they call before as the third world countries. And so we will now be looking at the age of economic cooperation, which is the third part of our discussion. Here we will be discussing about the European Union. This is the organization of Western European countries, mostly former first world countries which banded together economically, and they have one currency. They call this as the euro. So in case you are a tourist who will be traveling there, you don't need money changers if you are traveling in those countries which are members of the European Union, because you only need the euro. Okay, so they have what they call as porous borders, or no visa, easy and fast traveler from one European country to another, and they somehow relax trade restrictions. So they got less taxes for the members of the European Union, less threatening for sellers, and somehow it resulted to higher income for sellers. And so before the European Union was formed, you pay large amount of tax to countries you send your products to. After the formation of the European Union, if you are an exporter of French wine, you pay less tax, you get more income, you become richer quickly or quicker, and the richer citizens get, the richer the country becomes. However, there's also the organization, or the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation, or what we call as the APEC. Okay, somehow this operates like the European Union, where they try to relax tariffs or taxes among member countries, which the Philippines is actually a member of the association, or the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation. Now, the Philippines is a member of these cooperation. That's why we see a lot of foreign products in our market, like Poncan, apples, and others. The downside of which, though, is that some countries can compete economically with others, because some of the members of the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation definitely um, is very economically deprived, if not dependent to other member countries of the APEC. Say, for example, Korea, Japan, US sells computers, cars, appliances, and gadgets in large prices, however, lesser taxes, but they get large incomes from all of these, okay? However, the Philippines and other agriculture-based countries sell bananas. Of course, the chip is lesser, the lesser the tax, and also the smaller the income. The situation definitely was worsened by China, because China sells apples and pawn cans to the Philippines, and we patronize Chinese fruits over Philippine fruits. Thus, our farmers are on the disadvantage to this, because they get lesser income now. But we also have to look at what we call as the ASEAN Integration, or the Association of Southeast Asian Nation, or the ASEAN. Okay. Now here we have the ASEAN member countries like Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, Myanmar, Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, Thailand, and Brunei. We also have a new country in the Southeast Asia by the name of Timor Leste. However, it is not yet a member country of the Association of Southeast Asian Nation. The land somehow during the ASEAN integration proposed an EU-like setup back in 2015. However, the proposition was because Thailand is on the advantage and the Philippines will be on a disadvantage because Thailand has a lot to sell because they got a lot more agricultural products like rice, fruits compared to the Philippines. And so the question here right now is if the ASEAN integration and it's not yet in full swing, do you think that it would honestly be beneficial to the member countries of the ASEAN, particularly of the Philippines? Still, this is not yet in full swing. Now, the K to 12 program was also instituted, okay, to have a seamless transfer of students from one ASEAN state to another. Although I would agree with the K to 12 program, even though it was not really um, executed well by the government during the time of the previous administration. However, it might come to that period where the ASEAN region would have a common currency. So we do not know if it's going to work out that fine or not. Of course, what we see in this lesson is that there is a globalization of economy where countries tear down borders and merge their economies. They do this from mutual economic gain, or what they call as economic cooperation. However, definitely, despite of these organizations, we see that seemingly this is a sort of an advantage to some economies, perhaps what we call as an advantage to first world or developed economies, and still disadvantage to many disadvantage or developing economies. And so that wraps up our discussion on economic globalization. And again, this is Sir E, and I hope you learned something about our discussion today on economic globalization. Thank you.